This is Medieval Middle Eastern Ceramics. And this talk is about Safavid Iran and Ottoman Turkey. And we shall start with Iran. And the Safavids basically ran this part of the world under Shah Abbas. This is the greatest expanse of the Safavid realm, and basically founded the country that later became Iran. If you remember, in previous dynasties like Timurids and the Turkmen, it was all very split up. But the idea of having a country called Iran was basically a concept invented by the Safavids, also making Shia Islam the state religion. And so what we know of as modern Iran is basically a creation of the Safavid period. So it's really quite important. So that was their contemporaries include the Khanate of Bukhara, which we don't have much to say about in this course. The Mughal Empire, which there's not a lot to say in this course either. Not a lot of interesting pottery. Nice tiles, but that's it. And the Ottoman Empire, of course, which the second half of this lecture is about. So it's founded by this chap called Ismail, and he's hang on, let's go back. He lived in Tabriz, and the thing about Tabriz, I'll go back a bit further. The thing about Tabriz is it was rather close to the Ottomans, and when the Ottomans were expanding, and eventually actually ended up with part of this over here. So that having the capital in Tabriz was a bad idea. So they moved it to Qazvin. And there's a couple more guys. And then there was Shah Abbas. In his period, this was at its maximum. And he moved the capital to Isfahan. And there's like a few other guys. Not to worry about them. Remember Shah Abbas. That's an important guy. The first one. So, pottery production centers. Let's go back. Pottery production centers, of which there are a number, start off unusual for this course, in that it was there is documentary evidence for production, and this is because of those annoying Europeans who had by now come around the Cape of Africa. And had come into the Indian Ocean and gone to China and India and were directly trading. And so Europeans were trading with Iran and wanted to get pottery. Pottery that looked like Chinese pottery, because what they would often do is go back to Europe and sell it as Chinese, because it was actually very difficult to tell the difference. The Chinese were making a lot of export wares, which weren't the best, and the Iranians were making some very nice imitations of them, which some of those were actually quite good. So it is very difficult sometimes to tell the difference between the two products until you break it. So one of these references, a chap called Raphael Damas, who said in 1660 that the best wares are made in Kerman. That is Kerman, right there. See? And Jean Tavernier in 1654. In Kerman they made earthenware which comes very near to porcelain and looks as neat and fine. And the British East India Company letter of 1682 asked for pottery from Kerman and Mashhad, made in imitation of Chinaware. So we have a lot of evidence now for Kerman and Mashhad. Then we have Jean Chardin, who was there a couple of times in the 17th century, and he talks about the finest pottery being made at Shiraz, which is down here, Mashhad, which we've gone on about, Yazd, Kerman, here, and especially Zerand, which is next to Kerman. So this would give us some idea of production centers. Also, we have evidence for production in Isfahan. There is some reference to production of pottery in Isfahan, although they're not very complementary. So that's another center. So as you can see, we have lots of data, some of which is in some of these places. And so we started off with looking at the petrographic analysis of this, looking at the distribution of pottery we had, like Derbent up here. So we had a lot of pottery from there. And so we divided it then into 4 groups. This is Mashhad, and it seemed that this group is very likely Mashhad, looking at the distribution. This group, you can see there's a few around other places, but mostly it's around Kerman or outside of Iran. It seems to be the biggest center for export. And this group we think is the Isfahan group. Again, it made in a number of centers. So this is of the Mashhad group. There had been some attempts at distinguishing between Kerman and Mashhad, which the bulk of evidence would seem to suggest that one or the other was the main production centers for Safavid pottery. Mashhad pottery was generally thought to have blue with black lines, so cobalt blue with lines of black. This one's made in Mashhad and actually has lines of blue, so this is very nice. So this very nice, very close imitation of Chinese pottery tends to be very difficult to distinguish between Mashhad and Kerman, since they're both actually trying to look Chinese. So this one made in Mashhad in about 1630. Also this one, so very nicely done. This one does have black chromium oxide lines as well as the cobalt blue. And oh, I see, that was it. This here is a seal mark. Now, on the original pottery from China, they will often have seal marks, and they had seen these seals and thought, those are jolly nice, let's copy them. So of course this will say it's like, you know, the reign of some emperor or something, but this is just complete gobbledygook. And there are a number of these square reign marks on Mashhad pottery. However, there are very similar things on Kerman pottery, so they're not particularly helpful. And here's another rather nice blue and white from Mashhad. And another one. So they were making quite a lot of very nice pottery. But there was one area where they seemed to be just making pottery Mashhad, and that's lusterwares. Lusterwares, of course, are not made to copy imports of Chinese pottery. They are often referred to other sources of influence, including earlier Islamic pottery. But Mashhad seems to be the only center making lusterwares at this time. So the locally inspired wares tend to be more associated with specific centers. And here's another very nice lusterware from the Rom collection. So let me get to the Kerman products, and as I was mentioning in the previous lecture about Yemen, this is the pottery from Yemen. This one's found at Mocha, like where the coffee comes from, and this one is from a site near Zabid, and this is found at the same site. And one of the distinctive things about Kerman is this mark on the bottom. Again, it's trying to copy a Chinese character, not actually a reign mark. But what is useful about this is that it seems to be diagnostic of production at Kerman. It seems to be a unique thing that only the pottery from Kerman has this on the bottom. So if it is trying to look Chinese, and it's also trying to look Chinese by having this weird thing at the bottom, it's actually really looking like it's made in Kerman. And there's a nice red circle around it just to make it interesting. So Kerman is actually somewhere where we went to get pottery, and so we helped the analysis by having a lot of pottery that was from the site and was all of the same fabric, which is the fabric we were attributing to Kerman based on its predominance outside of Iran. Sort of very distinctive Iranian styles of pottery. Of course, this is like obviously not a Chinese person, but the distinctive way the blossoms are done on this, but particularly this slip painted technology. This is particularly associated with Kerman. We don't seem to have this sort of thing on Mashhad pottery. They were making lusterwares, and in Kerman they were making these polychrome slip painted wares. There's a very distinctive leaf inside a curling tendril, which is again a very distinctive attribute of Kerman, and this is a copper spout which doesn't belong, just so you know. Here's a variant on that thing which we call the tassel mark because it looks a bit like a tassel, and here's another one possibly related to it, but again you look at this and it's kind of difficult looking at the blue and white painting where it's from, but the mark would suggest that it is a Kerman piece, and the petrography would also indicate that. And this is a one with three things on it, tassel mark. Again with that motif with the leaves within the scrolling foliage, tendril rather. So again, this is quite blue and white and somewhat imitating the Chinese pottery, but it has that little uniquely Kerman thing. Here's another variant of the tassel mark. And yet more tassel marks. So this is what is often known as crack porcelain from the mid-17th century with these panels. A crack is a Portuguese boat. No, it's a Dutch boat. But it's a Dutch spelling for what is originally a Portuguese boat, I think. We often call them carracks in English. But it's a type of ship that sailed around and came back with pottery in it. So this is the kind of pottery that was in it at the time. And you could probably find this indistinguishable from a piece of Chinese pottery. But this one is made in Kerman. This one is a very distinctly Persian or Iranian dragon. Usually there are dragons. The dragon otherwise looks very similar to something you might see on Chinese pottery, but it's the way he's looking at you and looking so happy, which really makes this distinctly Iranian dragon and not the very noble beast of the Chinese dragon. This is like a happy dragon. And here's a bunch of tassels to show you. All of these are shown to be made in Kerman. So that brings us to Isfahan. So one of the things that made people associate Isfahan with pottery production are these tiles. These tiles are polychrome painted with these figures on, and it is known that there is a type of pottery that has similar figures on it. And since this is the only place with these tiles, it was hypothesized that these tiles are made in Isfahan and the pottery is also made in Isfahan. These are actually broken vessels, but you can see they're very similar. They are slip painted with coloured stone paste slips. The outside of the dishes have been lost on this, and they've probably been broken down by dealers, so they look like roundels you could set into a wall or something. But they're all whole vessels like this as well. So that brings us to that information about production centres. So we have Isfahan, right? So when we went to Isfahan and we were asking, so where are they making pottery around here? We were sent to Shahreza, which is here, which is some way away. And we had, of course, done all this petrographic analysis, and we had found that those slip-painted pieces of pottery were of a fabric that we were associating with Isfahan. And we went to Shahreza, and it's quite far away, which is interesting. Maybod, which I've also sampled, is one of the few stone paste production centres which has had a recent ethnographic study by a French group in the 60s. And one thing that is found from the study of the Maybod pottery is that once it leaves Maybod, it goes to Yazd and is sold around Iran as pottery from Yazd, Maybod being a very small village and Yazd being a big city. So, interestingly, that's quite interesting, that the pottery from Maybod is actually thought of in the rest of Iran as being the pottery of Yazd. And similarly, it would seem that the pottery from Shahreza may be the pottery from Isfahan, even though it's made at Shahreza. And which is interesting. There's Yazd. Isfahan to Shahreza is actually 74 kilometers. Maybod to Yazd is 55 kilometers. Which actually makes me think of Jean Chardin's reference to pottery from Shiraz, Kerman, and Zerand. So Kerman and Zerand. There's no other reference to pottery made in Zerand. It's a village outside of the major city of Kerman. But it makes me wonder, maybe the Kerman pottery is made in Zerand. No production centres were found in Kerman. That doesn't necessarily mean anything, but it is interesting to note that. Shiraz is interesting, referred to again by Jean Chardin and by nobody else. And for that, it's interesting to actually look at the communication patterns. There's a lot of traffic that goes up and down because of the nature of the geology and structure of Iran. There's a lot of folding that goes like this way and creates a lot of barriers. And so there's a lot of roads going this way, and then they tend to go over passes east and west. And the place you'll need to get to is the port of Bandar Abbas. So the importance of, to the Europeans, is what is the pottery called by the time it gets to Bandar Abbas. They're not going to go to any of these places. They're going to go to Bandar Abbas and ask for pottery. Can we have pottery from Kerman, please? And, of course, the pottery from Kerman is very possibly what the pottery from Zerand is called. And similarly, the pottery from Yazd. See, Yazd is one of the places referred to by Chardin, may actually be the pottery from Maybod, and Shiraz may in fact be the pottery from Shahreza or Isfahan. So it might be that all of these references are to the centres that we already know. I know what Maybod looks like because I've done recent pottery from there. I've also, and it didn't seem to be important in the Safavid period. Shahreza, however, does. Because they're making pottery there when I was there in the 90s. And I took lots of photographs. They're making nice pottery. However, they were making pottery with clay, which wasn't being imported. And so it wasn't helping us. So they said they did used to make pottery with stone paste, with crushed quartz and glass and a bit of clay. But they weren't doing it any longer. But if I looked at this vessel, that was made within recent times by these potters. This is a piece of pottery that was sitting in the workshop, and they said, yeah, that's what we used to make here out of stone paste. And as you can see, I look like I'm about to throw up into it. That's because I didn't, but I felt like it. I was suffering from, I may have mentioned, I think in Isfahan, I had a very bad sunstroke, and I was feeling very ill by the time I got to Shah Reza, and was feeling very ill. But the main point is we got this piece of pottery, and I sampled it, and it defined Shah Reza, which was the fabric we were attributing to Isfahan. Much later, we had a piece of pottery at the ROM donated by a collector, and he had a piece of pottery that looked of this type, which had on the bottom written "made at Shah Reza." So, and I thin sectioned that, and that's pretty much the same. So Isfahan, this is Isfahan fabric, and it's quite a nice piece of blue and white. Might be difficult otherwise to say whether this is made in Mashhad or Isfahan, but it's not. One thing that is distinctive of the Isfahan pottery is there's these lines are not paint but incisions. So this is actually what cobalt looks like under reducing conditions. So this might be accidental or it might be deliberate, but the lines in here, like defining the edges, are actually there because of incision into the stone paste body, and so the paint is thicker there. The same with the blue here. So these are all very distinctive of the Isfahan fabric, and they were also making these nice turquoise and black wares. And like that. Now let's go to the Ottomans. Now, the focus of the Ottoman Empire is, of course, Constantinople, or as we know it now, Istanbul. And of course, this was the center of the Roman Empire from 330 onwards, when Constantine decided, I am sick of living in Rome. For some reason, I'm going to move to this place, which he renamed Constantinople after himself. Not a man of a big ego, I'm sure. But so this was the center of the vast Roman Empire, as big as the ancient Roman Empire was at times, but eventually shrinking to not very big at all. But this is the ancestor of Rome, and they always thought of themselves as being Romans. And a very important aspect of the Ottoman Empire is to accept the fact that they consider themselves to be Romans. They are direct continuation of the Roman Empire. So there. So the Ottomans in about 1300, of course, they came in with the Seljuks from Central Asia, and the Seljuks were all over the shop, and the Ottomans ended up with this little bit over here. See this little green patch there? And you probably didn't even notice that appearing. So that's where they were in about 1300, very near to like the big prize right here. And they sort of always must have had their eye on that prize, and they were incorporated into the Byzantine army, and of course eventually took the place over. So this is the Ottomans in about 1481, and it's about this time that we start having evidence for making pottery, and some of it is documentary evidence, but by this time everything had been, in about 1450 they had conquered Constantinople itself and had basically set up a nice discrete area to be running the shop, and had founded the Ottoman Empire. It got bigger. So this is 200 years later, and this is before it started to decline and ending up, of course, being largely messed over in the First World War in 1914 to 1918. So the production centers, we have Istanbul. Istanbul itself, there is evidence of a imperial workshop. This is documentary evidence. We don't actually have any pottery evidence from it. And we have kilns and evidence from Iznik. And we have kilns and evidence from Kütahya. However, within the Ottoman realm, there is also Damascus. Damascus was a production center throughout this period, and it is to recent times. And so within that, we have the problem of of Iznik pottery. It's often called Iznik pottery. Ottoman pottery is often called Iznik pottery. And this is called Kütahya pottery. And we'll be looking at both of those. However, distinguishing between these centers is very difficult, even for petrographic analysis. Because I've done petrographic analysis of pottery from Damascus, and pottery from Kütahya, and pottery from Iznik. And the Damascus pottery, of course, is quite distinctive. It's large, rounded quartz, very clear quartz, very distinct from any other center that I've been able to identify. And there was, in fact, one piece of pottery which would have been identified as Iznik by any person, which I found to be of the Damascus fabric. So it was Iznik pottery made in Damascus. So that is odd. The other annoying thing is that I've looked at Iznik pottery and Kütahya pottery, wasters, and also pottery from elsewhere in the Middle East, and it seems at the moment I can't distinguish between the two production centers. They're both very finely ground, very clear quartz, which of course also means if you took the Damascus fabric and ground it very fine, because they did do that. We do have evidence from production centers where they would grind it finer to make nicer pottery. And so if you took the Damascus fabric and ground it very fine, it would look exactly like the wasters from Iznik and Kütahya, which is very annoying and very difficult to deal with. Now, this is from when I was looking at it recently. I actually looked at Iznik 20 years ago when I was working on the Timurids. Now, if you recall, I was mentioning how there are Timurid potters or Turkoman potters from Tabriz, which is just off the map here, came to found the potteries of both Istanbul and Iznik. But at that time I looked at the pottery, and it seemed to me that I was looking at them down the microscope at the same magnification for all of the pottery, because it's very important to always look, when you're looking at fluid inclusions that makes the quartz cloudy or clear or somewhat cloudy or something, at the same magnification, because if you look at higher magnification, you will be seeing more fluid inclusions. And so with this very fine pottery, I thought, I'm going to look at a higher magnification to see if I can see the difference. And the funny thing is, 20 years ago, I looked at it, and I swear I could tell the difference between Kütahya and Iznik and another center making Iznik wares, which may have been Istanbul. So I thought that 20 years ago, and then did nothing about it until I thought I should wrap this up before I walk away from Islamic pottery forever. And so I looked at it again, and I couldn't see any difference. And I have to wonder, is this because my eyesight isn't as good as it was? I don't know. But right now, I just feel Iznik ware is something you have put in quotation marks, because I actually have no idea where it is made. This is the piece that looks very much like the pottery made in Tabriz in, say, 1480, but it has those quite distinctive Ottoman, shall we say, Iznik style pansy-like fronds in here, but the fabric is Iznik. This is what the pottery looked like when people were saying, oh, this is Ottoman. So you can see it's quite similar in some ways, but in about 1480 they were very keen on making blue and white, as everybody else was, of course. Yeah, so that would be the extent when they were first making this pottery. So at the beginning of the 16th century, they're still making blue and white, but it's starting to look more distinct, less Chinese and more Ottoman. This is a distinctive style. People call it lots of different names, but as you can see, it's distinctive, and that's all that matters. These are dated to about 1530. In fact, the piece of pottery actually found in Syria, physically in every way looked like the very dense Iznik body, but when you thin sectioned it, it was made in Damascus, was of this type, this style with these spirals on it. Interestingly, this one also exactly the same as any Iznik ware is said to be Kütahya ware because it has Armenian written on it. Kütahya is often associated with Armenians, so if you take a piece of Iznik pottery and write on it in Armenian, people say it's Kütahya ware. So this is Iznik ware from the 1530s again. Again, you see the blue and white and clear Chinese influence, but taken to a very distinctly Ottoman style. So then they started getting into polychromy. So this is in the 1540s now, and you can see that there are colors which are quite nice, but they're not really quite as nice as they could be, as we showed later on. And here's another one. The red could be redder, maybe. And this is like the fully developed thing. In the 1560s, they were making this polychrome pottery with this very distinctive Ottoman style of decoration with underglaze painted and this red bowl, as it's called, an iron-rich paint, which became, really nice and an example of Ottoman art. And this is one in the Rom. You see, very, very typical, ultimately derived from the wave and rock pattern on the rim. But this is a very Ottoman pattern. But then the colors started to fade again. So you had this period when this was made in the late 16th century, when the colors were so vibrant, but then later on they start fading again. And so this is another piece of the Rom, and it's from the early 17th century. Now this is actually the 18th century, so we're leaping a bit, but again this is what is often called a Kütahya ware because it has Armenian in it. But one of the aspects of Kütahya ware is the things that are called Kütahya ware tend to be later than the things called Iznik wares. So it's possible they were both making pottery all of this time, but indistinguishable. So again, clearly Christian Armenian pottery, so therefore Kütahya. These bowls are very nice. We have some in the collection in Toronto, but these actually have Armenian on them, and seraphim on them. Very nice. And this is how they're used. I took these photographs in the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and you see here is a lamp, and so the lamps are filled with olive oil, and they're worried about the mice climbing into it, so they put these bowls, sort of like a squirrel baffle to stop squirrels getting at your bird food, and so they used to make them out of ostrich shells, until they made them out of ceramic. So these are Kütahya wares, and they made these cups. So the Kütahya cups again are this thing, and really Kütahya should also be in quotation marks, because I've also looked at these in the thin section, Kütahya cups from around the Middle East, including Syria and the Yemen, and they do not seem to be all made in the same place. So I really should go back and look at all this stuff one day and make a final decision, and I don't know, get a better microscope or better spectacles or something. So Kütahya wares are very important. These little cups, these are coffee cups, of course. You remember from a lecture about Yemen, coffee became very important, and so in Kütahya, or wherever they made the Kütahya cups, they made pottery for drinking coffee out of quite a lot. So that is the the later centuries of Islamic pottery production. And I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you.